Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm just about to start. I suspect one or two people may just be clicking into the webinar as we go along. About me, I'm Dan Wild. I head up the employment team at Harding Evans. Harding Evans is a large commercial law firm. We employ 110 staff. We deal with quite a wide range of employment law issues. I personally have handled many complex discrimination cases, many issues arising that have been quite high profile, come to the appellate courts. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, in the last 2 or 3 months, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been around furloughing.
Dan, if you can hear me, I can't see you.
Okay, the intention is that you don't get to see us as we go through.
Okay.
So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to go through the revised flexible furlough scheme that comes into being from the 1st of July 2020 to look at how employee pay is calculated during flexible furlough, looking at revised furlough arrangements, annual leave and furlough, and I'm going to touch upon some issues relating to workplace transition back to work and briefly touch upon redundancy and furlough, though for those of you who are hoping to hear more about this, there is a previous webinar that we've done that can be accessed through our website. So dealing with the furlough scheme, I think the important thing to note now is in relation to the furlough scheme, it is now closed to new entrants. So if a member of staff hasn't been furloughed previously, they can now not be furloughed, but there are some limited exceptions due to returners from maternity and paternity leave where the employer has already used the scheme, and I think I saw last night also potentially for military reservists, but I think that's going to be a very exceptional exception that's relied upon. So up to the 31st of July, the furlough grant continues as it has done to date, potentially providing a grant for up to 80% of salary to a maximum contribution payable in relation to an employee of 2,500 for an employee who earns 3,125 and above. But as I say, the scheme is now closed to new entrants, with staff having to have been on furlough for at least 3 weeks prior to the 30th of June 2020 to be enabled to continue the scheme, even if the member of staff is not on furlough as at the 30th of June. If they've had one previous furlough period of 3 weeks at any time during the period 1st of March to the 30th of June, they can continue to participate in the furlough scheme. Now, some employers may have used the scheme to have 30 on furlough at one time, a different 30 at a different time, and a different 30 at a different time. So potentially may have had 90 employees on furlough, but if the maximum number that you've had on furlough at any one time is 30, going forward, even though you may have used 90 employees in the furlough scheme, you're going to be limited to the maximum number that you've had in the furlough scheme at any one time. So the maximum that you've had most out of work is 30, that will be the maximum that you can have for the remaining period of the furlough scheme. So we're just going to run through the changes to the furlough grant. During July, it remains as before, with 80% of pay capped at 2,500, with the government funding employers' NICs on the furlough pay amount, and also the minimum statutory pension contributions that arise from auto-enrolment. From August, the scheme becomes less generous, and from August, the government will cease to fund employers' national insurance contributions on furlough pay, and will also cease to fund the minimum pension contributions. The estimate that will start to result in a 5% additional cost to employers. From September, the employee will remain entitled to 80% of pay, but the government will only contribute up to 70% of pay, capped at £2,187.50. So again, that will mean that there'll be an additional layer of cost that employers will start to have to incur. From October, for the last month of the scheme, the employee will remain entitled to 80% of pay, but the government will only contribute up to 60% of pay, capped at £1,875. And in September and October, again, the government will not be funding employers' national insurance contributions and minimum pension contributions. So obviously you can see that the level of contribution is being scaled back, and as it currently stands, the scheme has been announced as ending at the 31st of October 2020, so no more furlough grant from that time onwards. The change that comes into being from the 1st of July 2020 is that, unlike what has happened to date, employees can now work part-time and be furloughed for the times that they're not required to work. Another big change is up till now, furloughs had to have been for a minimum block of 3 weeks. Going forward, it can now be determined weekly, so you can have a weekly arrangement whereby an employee is furloughed 3 days but works 2 days, and then perhaps the following week they could work 4 days but be furloughed 1 day. So there's much more flexibility built into the scheme. And obviously, as we've already mentioned, during July, the government grant remains the same. But under the part-time furlough working arrangements, the employees are paid by the employer at the normal rate of pay for the time actually worked, and under the job retention scheme when not working. But the key point to note on the cap on the grant is proportionate to the percentage week work. For example, somebody works 50% of the week, then the contribution to the furlough pay will only be £1,250 at the highest paid level. So it doesn't benefit higher paid staff. For example, the grant won't be capped at 2,500. It will be capped proportionate to the amount of the week actually worked. Let's just look at flexible furlough pay. So we know that the furlough scheme is pretty much limited in terms of the maximum contribution currently on an employee who's paid at £37,125 per annum or £3,125 per month. So if that employee is currently furloughed and is only receiving an amount of pay equivalent to the maximum furlough pay, which is £2,500 per calendar month. So you agree with that employee who normally works 40 hours per week that they'll return to work working 20 hours per week. So that employee will be on full pay for 20 hours and furloughed for the other 20 hours and paid 80%. That effectively will mean that employee will take home gross 90%, with 50% being paid for by the employer and 40% paid by the job retention scheme. And this calculation only really applies during July, because obviously from July and August, because obviously from September and October, the government contribution obviously reduces, as we've outlined in the previous slide. And for those who have a level of responsibility for payroll, it's well worth reading the government guidance for this, because it does a much more detailed calculation running through national insurance contributions and pension contributions. But what this calculation does show you is, at least during July and August, where the amount of pay remains the same, is that the employee potentially can be slightly better off financially by returning to work part-time, because they're paid in full for the hours actually worked, and they are paid through the furlough scheme for the remainder of the time. I initially suspected that there would be a cap on pay equivalent to the cap, and that hasn't come into place. The cap applies purely in relation to the furlough hours and not to the time that the employee actually spends working. So potentially what this scheme does is allow a greater degree of flexibility for those employers who have got some level of activity but who are not up at full normal business levels of activity. So how will flexible furlough work? Flexible furlough will need to be agreed with the employees in writing. Potentially, if you're going to change things on a week-by-week basis, that could create a bit of an administrative headache. But in principle, you do need to record your agreements with employees in writing. For example, if they're coming back for 3 days a week and being furloughed for 2 days a week, that should be recorded in writing. As I've already indicated, you no longer have to do this in 3 weekly blocks. You can, in theory, plan it on a weekly basis. It is still possible if you're a business that's actually having employees in, so let's say you've got a workforce of 40, you've been working on a basis of 20 in and 20 furloughed, you can still have a flexible rota of staff in and out. That's still potentially possible going forward. The advantage that you have is that you no longer have to plan that in 3 weekly blocks. You potentially could, going forward, plan this on a weekly basis. As I indicated earlier, employers will be capped as to how many employees that they have on furlough to the maximum number that have been out at any one time prior to the 30th of June. And as I say, what potentially that may need to have in place going forward is the need for a new written agreement with your employees. What I will say to make life easier, an email exchange, in my view, could potentially constitute a new written agreement. It doesn't necessarily specify that each individual written agreement needs to be signed physically. So that deals with flexible furlough. One of the questions I keep getting asked quite a lot about is about annual leave during furlough. Throughout the furlough period, holiday has continued to accrue. The government guidance is quite clear that it continues to accrue at the normal contractual rate, unless you varied that, as I have done with some employees, to the minimum annual leave that can accrue, which is statutory working time regulations, which it means leave accrues at 5.6 weeks per annum, or I think that's 2.33 days a month. If an employee wants to take furlough, then annual leave during furlough, holiday does not disrupt furlough. So an employee can actually request to take annual leave and be paid in full during a period of furlough, and that doesn't disrupt a furlough arrangement. I've had questions about bank holidays. Bank holidays can be taken, and you can maintain that bank holidays are taken, providing you pay in full, or they can be deferred. If you just kind of left employees in furlough and not taken a positive step to say bank holidays are paid in full, or dealt with that through payroll and paid them in full, then arguably that becomes part of employees' annual leave that they can use going forward. It seems to me that you could potentially backdate it and correct that pay, possibly, but I think that's something that you would need to have a specific discussion with me about, just to deal with the risks and pros and cons that could arise if you try and say to an employee, well, actually that day back in May or Easter was actually a bank holiday and we're now paying you in full. So you don't have too many days that employees can take as discretionary leave or discretionary days off going forward, particularly as lockdown starts to ease. Now, there's been quite a lot of academic debate, and the government guidance says that the normal notification requirements in relation to annual leave under the working time regulations that still apply, which means that you could say in 2 weeks' time, you, my employee, have to take 2 weeks annual leave. So you could actually, according to government guidance, mandate that staff have to take time off, even though they are furloughed. But then almost in the next paragraph of the guidance, the government guidance goes on to say that employers must consider whether employees can rest, relax and enjoy leisure time during furlough. And there's been certainly quite a lot of academic debate as to whether, particularly where we still have significant lockdowns, particularly within Wales, whether employees can actually take a proper holiday during furlough. All I can say is I think there probably will be some test cases in tribunals in relation to whether employers can compel employees to take annual leave during furlough. As I say, the government guidance mandates that you can. I can see lots of potential arguments under European legislation as to whether you can compel employees to take a period of annual leave when they're actually already on a leave period. For example, just to give an example, imagine trying to mandate to your employees that they must take annual leave during a period of sickness leave, and we know that contravenes European legislation and case law. Trying to mandate that employees can take annual leave during maternity leave, again, that would probably fall foul of European leave. It seems to me counterintuitive that employees can be mandated to take annual leave when they're already off work. As I say, I think these are issues that are going to be tested in the courts if you are minded to take a view on risk in relation to that. And obviously, I obviously want to have a more detailed discussion with you in relation to that. You potentially have the backing of of the government guidance. But as I say, it's an interesting issue that I think might well be tested in the tribunals in due course. But obviously, that will be some way down the line. All I would say is if you do either mandate that leave is taken on a compulsory basis or employees request to take leave during furlough, then holiday pay should be paid in full as 100% of normal pay and shouldn't be calculated by reference to furlough pay. I'm going to touch really a little bit, and I'm probably going to do another webinar on work transition. So I'm not going to talk for lots of time in relation to work transition. But everybody should be aware that it's the employer's responsibility, if it is going to bring its employees back to the workplace, to make workplaces COVID secure. And I probably should re-emphasise that it still remains the case both in England and in Wales, and also in Scotland and Northern Ireland, if we have any subscribers from those countries, that the government guidance, both in England and Wales and Scotland, is that employees should continue to work from home if they can. Where, for whatever reason, you are bringing employees back to work because work cannot be done at home, it is your responsibility to make your workplaces COVID secure. And I can't go through in this webinar the kind of extent of the detail about government guidance, but absolutely there is a requirement to undertake risk assessments in relation to COVID. So there is no substitute for reading the government guidance and then drawing up your own workplace risk assessments. What I'm just going to have a quick look at, and bear in mind the impact of COVID could be long-term on working practices. How do you deal with managing your staff back to work? How do you deal with the concerns of the clinically vulnerable? As I say, government guidance remains that employees must return to work, must continue to work from home wherever possible. An employee should only ask employees to attend the workplace only if the work cannot be done at home and only if it has taken all reasonable practical steps to reduce the risk from coronavirus. And employers will need to communicate clearly with its employees about the measures that have been put in place to preclude or to minimise the risk of contracting coronavirus. And employees should be aware that in principle they can be held liable if it can be proven that coronavirus has been contracted in the workplace. If you have an employee who is in receipt of a shielding letter because they are clinically extremely vulnerable from COVID, or possibly because they're unable to work because they have childcare responsibilities, really, I think employers should not be requiring their employees to return to the workplace. It should be exploring other options, such as adjusting the employee's role to enable them to return to work from home or keeping them on furlough. If an employee has health concerns that makes them more vulnerable, but they're not in shielding in the shielding category, again, my view is that the employer should still consider alternatives to requiring the employee to return to the workplace, taking into account the duty to make reasonable adjustments for any employee who has a disability, which may apply in many cases. What I would say is that employees who are heavy-handed and take disciplinary action in relation to an employee who refuses to attend to work could lead an employer open to a number of claims, including discrimination claims, and potentially expose themselves to claims of unfair dismissal. My view is that tribunals are going to be unsympathetic to employers who are too heavy-handed, which is not to say that as furlough starts to taper back, that employers are obliged to continue to pay their staff who are unwilling to work, but taking the ultimate step of ending employment may be relatively high risk. Employers are going to have to deal with concerns about employees who use public transport to get to work, and certainly I think employers are going to be well advised to explore options with staff to allow them to travel at a quieter time by changing start times. And so employers are going to have to be sympathetic to varying workplace starts and finish times. And just remember, because some staff are prepared to use public transport, does not necessarily mean that it will be reasonable to expect other employees to do the same. If an employer is confident that it's reasonable to instruct the employee to attend work after putting in place all the measures it can do to control the risks, and where it is not possible for an employee to work from home after exploring with the employee their individual work circumstances, you as an employer will need to explore the options. One option may be to ask employees to agree to a period of unpaid leave. If they do not agree to this, then if an employee is unable to work, they're not necessarily going to be entitled to receive pay in any event. You do have the option of taking disciplinary action leading to dismissal, though I see problems with employment tribunals, and I think considerable risk in relation to reputational damage, and there's certainly more reputational damage, I think, in terms of dismissing somebody rather than withholding pay from somebody who is not able to attend the workplace. One of the other issues that we perhaps need to be starting to consider, when we put staff, or many businesses put staff onto furlough, it was done very urgently. And although the guidance was that any decision should be made as to who and who not to furlough should be done on a fair and reasonable basis, I suspect many employers made these decisions in a rush. But certainly when you plan who is coming back to work, you've got more opportunity to plan who comes back and when and how to do it fairly than perhaps you did when you put staff onto furlough. There's certainly always going to be a risk of challenges to decisions to unfurlough, because of course for many employees who are furloughed, they are receiving less pay than those staff who are not furloughed, and for some staff that may be important. Employers are potentially vulnerable to risks of claims based on unreasonable selection as to who is allowed to return to work and come back to full pay. Decisions can be challenged under this discrimination legislation based, for example, on a protected characteristic, for example, disability, pregnancy, or gender. And also claims employers could be challenged through decisions based upon a breach of the implied term of trust and confidence. So how then do you choose further who can return to work? Employers will need to ascertain which workers and what working practices are best done in specific locations. Employees could be asked for their view as to whether they are willing to volunteer to return to work, because it's likely, particularly within larger workplaces, some employees will want to return to work, whereas some employees may be happy to remain on furlough. So it could be useful to start exploring who is willing to come back into work and on what basis, to understand what concerns employees might have about returning to work. And this will enable you to plan how you can use your office space so as to minimise the risk of COVID, and also to start planning health and safety risk assessments for those who will be working from home for longer periods of time. If you have too many employees who want to return to work, you may need to consider implementing rota systems, or making selections based on an objective basis, or using the flexible furlough scheme to share the return to work around on a fair and reasonable basis. One of the things that you're going to need to consider is implementing rota systems where you have your employees in the same team when they are in work, and splitting employees into smaller contained teams if possible, helping you to contain any risk of coronavirus in your workplace to smaller groups. Obviously, the more connections an person has within the workplace, the greater the number of people that could be infected if an employee catches coronavirus. And obviously, one of the things that you potentially may need to consider into your workforce planning requirements is the implications of track and trace. Could potentially mean that employees who are in work could be required to self-isolate for 14 days if they've been exposed to coronavirus. And certainly, employers are going to be well alive to the fact that due to the constant news stories that have taken place over the last 3 months, and remember, coronavirus is still out there, and in some areas of the country, the R rate is very close to 1, or it is on some studies above 1, for example, in the northwest. You know that you are going to have staff who are very apprehensive about returning to the workplace. And as I say, the implications of track and trace and the requirement to self-isolate could, if you don't plan your workforce planning particularly well, could mean that you could have to have employees who are having to self-isolate at home for another further period of 14 days. One thing that we've touched upon is can staff demand to come into work. You're certainly not required to reopen your buildings to accommodate employees whose home circumstances mean they cannot work from home, or the work is such that they cannot do at home. Though if you have employees that seem desperate to return to the workplace, it's certainly worth inquiring whether they need special support until the office or your workplace reopens. Obviously, that's slightly more difficult for some manufacturing scenarios. Sorry, I probably have gone a little bit too far. I was going to touch upon redundancy. Obviously, I've already done one webinar on redundancy in varying terms and conditions of employment to enable employers to start planning for when furlough schemes come to an end, or costs start to, or businesses realising that actually they cannot, or they will not need the same staff levels on a long-term basis because of the economic downturn that's almost inevitably happening in consequence of furlough. We've seen today or yesterday that the jobless total has gone up by 612,000 within Wales. The people signing on for unemployment has doubled from this time last year. I think what I wanted to say is that redundancy can be planned and progressed while employees are on furlough. There are some practical difficulties if a staff member refuses to attend a meeting while on furlough. I mean, and it seems to me that potentially it may be difficult to compel that an employee attends a redundancy consultation meeting while they're on furlough, because technically they are on leave and not at the beck and call of their employer. Certainly in some exceptional cases, there may be members of staff who are on furlough and may actually be working elsewhere because they've been permitted to do so. So I don't think that you can necessarily press on and insist that a member of staff who is furloughed is required to attend a consultation meeting. Certainly in my experience, I haven't had an employee take that point with their employer yet, but I certainly think it is possible for them to do so. Though of course you now have the option of applying flexible furlough to enable a member of staff to attend meetings on a day per week, so that they're actually required to work 1 day per week. I mean, I know that I have talked about agreeing things with employees, but potentially the flexible furlough scheme, it seems to me, does enable you to progress consultation meetings as we come into July by bringing back a staff member 1 or 2 days a week over a 2-week period to go through a normal redundancy consultation period. It also seems to me that it is perfectly lawful for employees to be required to work out their notice on furlough scheme. And of course, if you require a member of staff to work out notice on furlough, you have the advantage that the furlough grant contributes towards notice costs. Certainly it will be a requirement for employees who are only entitled to statutory notice of 1 week per year of service to be paid in full if they are working out their notice, but still the furlough grant would be a cost-effective substitute to the cost of notice pay. And I certainly think my view would be, there is obviously a decision for individual employers, that if you are going to be requiring employees to work out their notice on furlough, that some consideration should be given to being paying that member of staff in full, even if their notice period is longer than the statutory notice period. Just to explain that point, it is a statutory requirement for employees who are working out a period of statutory notice to be paid in full during the statutory notice period. That contractual provision, strictly speaking, does not apply to employees who are entitled to a longer period of notice than statutory notice. For example, statutory notice is at the very most 12 weeks. So any employee who's entitled to 3 months notice wouldn't be entitled to be paid in full during, if they're on furlough, but given the cost differential, it may be prudent to consider whether you should pay the employee in full during furlough. I've just highlighted payments in lieu of notice. If you choose to make a pay in lieu of notice, even if that member of staff has been paid on furlough, you will not be entitled to a grant towards the cost of a payment in lieu of notice. So it may potentially be more cost effective to have your member of staff work out notice pay while on furlough. It will be the case that while working out notice, that staff will continue to accrue annual leave. Then it may be worth considering then whether you wish to give your staff notice that you require them to take annual leave during the period of notice that they are working out on furlough. I mean, as I say, this is about reducing your costs. You have to balance that against risk, reputational damage of doing that, and actually the level of cost that you're actually incurring while you do that. Those are decisions for each individual business to take. But it is certainly a legal option. Whether it is the right thing to do for your business will be a decision that you need to take. Okay, that's the end of me talking at you. I hope you found the informative part of this webinar useful. Within the confines of technology, I'm happy for you to unmute and try and deal with any questions that anybody may have. So if you have questions, I think all you can do is speak out, and I will do my best to try and take questions. Obviously, if two people talk at once, I'll just try and do the best that I can. So does anybody have any questions?
Yes, please.
If you try and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Okay, my name is Lisa. I work for a public relations company. So I just wanted to know, regarding the redundancy while on furlough, if it's a member of staff who's been with you less than 2 years, do all of those points still stand?
Potentially, yes. I mean, it's always good practice to follow a consultation period. And within the confines of this webinar, obviously, I would suggest that it is best to follow good practice, because although employees with less than 2 years service cannot pursue claims for unfair dismissal, there are certain statutory claims that they can still pursue. Claims can be pursued, for example, on the basis of a protected characteristic. For example, I could think of scenarios where employers have imposed pay cuts, employees have asserted statutory rights, and statutory claims can be made there. And obviously, I'm more than happy to advise properly, separately of a webinar as to the level of risk that you incur. In many cases, it may be low risk, and I've certainly got employers who are taking a relatively hard-nosed approach to consultation for those staff with less than 2 years service to just simply get people off the payroll, recognising that they're not going to need those staff in the medium term because of the economic impact of COVID.
Thank you.
Next question.
Not from me, sorry.
Go on, that's fine, Lisa. Any more questions?
Dan? Hello?
Hello, I can just about hear you. I don't know who that's speaking, so.
It's Mike Williams. Really just to get your thoughts on something. I think we're seeing some employers obviously issuing questionnaires for return to work, so surveying their staff around their situation and their, I guess, views, thought process and ability to return to work. I mean, again, obviously our business is mostly office work because we're currently remaining at home at the moment. But obviously the appropriate time, would you advise that's a good thing to do? And if so, would there be any areas that you advise that we should not be questioning, if we were going to do a survey of our staff?
Okay, I'm very conscious that Mike kind of cut in and out there. I think the question was around some businesses, and we've done this, have started doing surveys to their staff about returning to the workplace. And do I advise that employers do that? I certainly think there's considerable merit in relation to doing that, particularly if you are requiring staff to return to a physical workplace. Obviously, I know your business, Mike, is an office-based business, and potentially the government guidance still applies, particularly, it applies within Wales and England, that if your staff can work from home, then they should do so. But obviously, it is becoming harder to have all of your staff out, and you may need some of your staff back in the workplace for whatever reason. And I certainly think there is certainly some merit in doing a workplace survey to ascertain employees' views, because some employees are going to find it more challenging to return physically to work for health reasons, because they're having to manage children who are not able to do what they normally do, either in terms of going to school, in terms of wraparound childcare, because lots of people rely on grandparents. Kind of summer clubs won't exist during the summer holidays, etc., etc. So I certainly think there is merit in doing a workplace survey, particularly where you are varying the arrangements that have applied to date and you are looking to get your staff back into the physical workplace.
That's great, yeah, thank you.
Anybody else have any more questions? I've certainly got some time to take questions, so more than happy to take any more questions. Okay, going once, going twice. Last opportunity for questions. Okay, on the basis I haven't had any more questions, thank you all for joining us today. We've certainly had lots of interest in this webinar. I'm certainly planning to do the next one more around transition back to work and some of the issues that you have to consider in relation to that. That'll probably take place in 2 to 3 weeks' time. Hope everybody found this session useful and informative, and stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Much appreciated.